All right. All right, folks. It is our second class for Kings and Chronicles. If that's the one you've signed up for, then you are in the right place. We're going to begin again here in just a couple moments at where we left off at First Chronicles chapter 4. If you want to go ahead and turn to First Chronicles chapter 4. As we spoke, I'll tell you what, before we do that, it's always a good idea if we're going to have a study of God's Word, let's go to Him in prayer, and then we will begin our study in earnest. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for the day that you've blessed us with. We're thankful, Lord, for the fact that you woke us up this morning to allow us to do the things of the day and that you brought us here together tonight. We ask, Lord, your blessings on those who are gathered for this study. We ask that you bless them in their study. Help us have discernment of your word. Help us have understanding of your word. We know that the beginning of all good things is knowledge, and it's knowledge of your scriptures that bring us the most blessing. And we pray your blessings on all of those who are gathered for this class. We ask, Lord, that you bless the sick that we know of. We ask that you give them their health back, if it be your will. Be with those who may be traveling. Keep them safe as they travel to and from their destinations. Most of all, Lord, we thank you for your son, Jesus. And we're thankful for the sacrifice that he made on that cross on Calvary so many years ago, and the blessing that still sustains us even today. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Okay. Good evening. All right, we made mention last week, First Chronicles chapter 1 through 27. It's interesting that this is the first 27 chapters of First Chronicles. A great portion of that is actually mirrored in other scriptures. So in our minds, it probably would make greater sense to us if we took Chronicles and put it first, because 2 Samuel is mirrored through much of First Chronicles. So what we're going to do is we're going to get through the first 27 chapters, not tonight, but we're going to get through the first 27 chapters of Chronicles. And then in chapter 28 and First Kings chapter 1 is when the narratives begin to come together a little bit better. And we'll go back and forth as time permits. We'll go back and forth, and then we'll finish our study going in that direction. But we're going to continue on now through First Chronicles, and we left off in chapter 4 last week. Now, the purpose in this first portion of that, it doesn't require a whole lot of comment on the genealogy. In the first place, they're not really completely understood as to their exact meaning by pretty much anybody living thousands of years after the generations that were listed. All right, it is almost impossible to unravel these genealogies with any real certainty. Now, that does not mean that does not cast any aspersions or throw any doubt on the genealogies. It's simply that they will not mean as much to us today as they did to the people for whom they were written so many years ago. All right, you've got the duplication of a lot of names, the appearance of many of those names that cannot be distinguished as whether they're applicable to people or to places. And there's a lot of uncertainty in regards to the genealogies, and it kind of complicates the problem of any real complete understanding of all of those chapters. It's also true that some textual corruptions in a few places kind of add to the problem. But suffice it to say, they were divinely inspired, and they were written down, for the edification of those who would read those, and they were read for certain. But nevertheless, big three-letter word, but the big purpose, the great purpose of the author is fully achieved in those opening 9 chapters. All right, we're going to continue on with those in a minute. But they are, in reality, the introduction to the entire Chronicles, all of them. And the very existence of these records and the extent to which these records exist among the Jews is overwhelming evidence that the New Testament genealogies in Matthew 1 and Luke 3 were received by that whole first century generation as absolutely accurate. All right? Absolutely accurate. And those records were never challenged by those who would be opponents of the gospel. So the importance of this in this proper identification of the Messiah is indeed significant, right? Jesus was going to come through a particular tribe, through a particular family, and it is evident that is exactly what occurred. So we can lay that whole idea that these were they were somehow incomplete, or they were not necessary. We can kind of put that to bed. All right. So most of these genealogies are incomplete. They've got several breaks in the lists, but the main line is there. The line of the Davidic dynasty, as well as other significant genealogies pertaining to the religious history of Israel, is here. So these genealogies, I saw it quoted, these genealogies are thundering proof that the Bible is history and not myth or legend. All right, that's the first 9 chapters. So let's go to First Chronicles chapter 4 and verse 15. Just looking at a couple of snippets here and there in the text, and we'll just kind of look at these as we continue on. But there's a lot that we've got to get through, so we're going to try to do that as quick as possible. All right, in First Chronicles 4 verse 15, we have Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. Who's Caleb? That's right. This man, along with Joshua, was one of the which of the spies, though? Remember, there was a significant number of spies, but there were 2 that were faithful. These were faithful spies, right? These are the men who came back with a favorable report, and they said, "The Lord is with us. Let's go do it." And the rest of them said, "But no, these men are giants. Look at it. We're grasshoppers in their sight. There's no way." But these men were faithful. Joshua and Caleb were faithful spies, and unfortunately, they were overridden, as is often the case, by the majority, the unfaithful majority. People were discouraged, and they said, "We can't do it." Now, here we think about that in terms of what God had done for them thus far, and we look at this and we wonder, have these people, I mean, here's God has been with them in the midst from the very beginning. Have they forgotten about who it is that traveled with them and who went before them into everything that they did? And they forgot about it. And what happened? There were only two groups of people who were saved throughout that wandering in the desert, and it was the families of Joshua and Caleb. The rest of them died in the wilderness, and only that next generation was the one that came in to inhabit the land. All right. Then we go to First Chronicles chapter 4 and verse 9. We have Jabez, named in sorrow. His mother's statement that she bore him in sorrow is probably a reference to maybe some unusual or heavy suffering found in childbirth. That may be the case. But Jabez's prayer is one of the noblest found in the Old Testament. And you've probably heard at least one preacher use the prayer of Jabez as a sermon. Yes. And some people accuse Jabez of being selfish in his prayer. But at the end of the day, what do we request of God? We request what we want from him, what we desire, what would be needful. Always understanding that God is going to give us what we need, what he wants us to have, not necessarily what we want. Now, he may enlarge us, but he may do it in a manner that we don't think about, that may have never come to our minds. But he is going to do what seems good and right and proper for him to do. All right. So if you base this idea of it's said by some that his prayer was crude and selfish, and his conscience was not troubled by the thought that others would suffer if he gained his wishes. But I don't share in that opinion at all. For one thing, what did God do with the prayer? Did he answer it or did he not answer it? He answered it, didn't he? So if God answered the prayer, was the prayer a righteous prayer and unrighteous prayer? In God's sight, it was perfectly acceptable prayer because he gave him what he asked, right? Exactly. All right. God doesn't typically answer evil thoughts. He's not going to give us the evil. He's going to give us the good. So the fact that his prayer was answered indicates that his prayer was offered from a pure heart rather than a selfish or evil desire for gain at the expense of other people. Absolutely. And if it says that, is it true? Of course it is. He will not answer those prayers, but he answered his prayer. Thus, we can rightfully understand that it was a prayer offered from a righteous heart. All right, so chapter 4, we go to chapter 4, verses 24. We see the sons of Simeon. And this genealogy of Simeon is kind of fragmentary, and it kind of reflects the idea, the concept, and the fact that this tribe lost its identity fairly early on in the nation of Israel, and it was absorbed into the tribe of Judah. Again, we're not going. The
Brother, is it me? I cannot hear you.
This is Margaret. I can't hear you either.
Chuck, you've lost your sound.
You're good. Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you now.
We can hear you now.
Excellent.
Sorry about that. I could hear him all the time. Yeah. What's the problem? Right?
All right. So let's continue on. So we understand why what happened with Reuben. Reuben would have normally been that birthright coming to the firstborn would have come to him, but because he had done what he did, it was taken away from him. So let's go to first chapter 5 and verse 25. And they trespassed against the God of their fathers and played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land. Does that sound familiar? That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Remember, what was the reason that God swept away the people of Canaan before the children of Israel came into the land? It was because of their what? Their unbelief, their idolatry, their wicked practices. And I think one of my paper topics is the idea of idolatry and idolatrous practices in the land of Canaan. And that could either be before or after the Israel comes into the land. But if you go and you look at the practices that were actually being performed, most of them were being done in the name of practicing a faith or a worship towards a particular God. But many of them, as a matter of fact, most of them engaged in some sort of sexual deviancy in order to worship those false gods. So it was a repugnant thing before God. Number one, the nations had put these other gods before him. And the other, much of it was engaging in practices that were repugnant in the eyes of God from as far back as antiquity. You know, God always had in mind that there would be one man and one woman for life. And what they had done is they had taken a false worship of idols and it incorporated sexual sin into it. So it was sort of this, I guess you call it a double barrel whammy in that regard. All right. So he said, they trespassed against the God of their fathers and played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land. So when they did not do as God told them to do and sweep out all of the Canaanites, they allowed some of them to remain. And then they began to marry, intermingling in the tribes. These people would come in with their false gods and they fell prey to them. A lot of it is the idea, again, that that false worship was it involved behavior that was attractive. The idea of the cult prostitutes. Prostitution was rampant because of that idolatry, as well as sharing spouses and sharing husbands and wives and all of these other things. And then you had, of course, the abhorrent practice of child sacrifice and all of these things. But it's incredible what we desire. And remember, there's three ways in which all men are tempted, right? The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And all of these, right? Every single one of those, if you look at the idolatrous practices, they appeal to one of those things. It was going to make them attractive to the gods. It was interesting to look at. It was, and we think of that in our skin kind of crawls, but to these people, They saw these idolatrous practices, and there was something engaging about it. There was something attractive to it, right? So, and they thought that it was going to do something for them. They thought that the gods were going to bless them for that. So they were attracted to sin in that fashion. Yes, ma'am.
Satan makes sin. That Israel never had a strong resistance to suggestion.
Yeah. They fell prey. And it's interesting as you see the rulers go, so went the people. And God warned them about that, didn't he? He told them, he said, you don't want a king. You want me to be your king. With God as their king, they would remain faithful. But when they rejected God, they wanted the kings of, but remember what they said. They said, we want to be like the other nations. We want a king that will go out before us into battle. And God says, okay, all right, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go and you're going to warn them about everything that's going to happen. And what happened to these kings? They led their own people into sin. All right. So he says, continue on in verse 25 and 26, and they trespassed against the God of their fathers, played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land. I like that phraseology. They played the harlot. They played the harlot. They engaged in spiritual adultery with false gods, whom God destroyed before them. And the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and of Tilgath-Pilneser, king of Assyria, and he carried them away, even the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half tribe of Manasseh, and brought them into Halah and Habor, and to the river goes on into this day. Now, this was the captivity of the tribes of Israel that inhabited the country east of Jordan. And this took place about 11 years prior to the fall of Samaria, that was going to occur a little bit later on, when the rest of the northern kingdom was going to be pulled away by the Assyrians and to be dissolved. I mean, it was going to disappear like dust in the wind. There would be no return for the northern kingdom. That's chapter 5, verses 25 and 26. Again, we're just getting little snippets of each of these chapters. All right. Let's go to chapter 6. Now, it's interesting that a lot more time and energy and space is devoted to the genealogies of the Levites. The reason, of course, is what tribe was. Each of these tribes were disparate. They were separate and they were individual. They had their own individual identity. But what was the overriding concern of the Levitical tribe, the tribe of Levi? What was its purpose? It was to do what for all of the tribes? That's right. It was to provide spiritual instruction. It was to lead the congregation, the nation of Israel, in worship. It was to do all of those things. They were to set as an example for the rest of the tribe. So the tribe of Levi has a lot more space devoted to all of the names and all of these, all the people that were going to come through that. Of course, the most important one that we find is the sons of Aaron. In verse 3, the sons of Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. And if you go all the way through this, you'll see that the Levitical tribe was a large tribe. It was a substantial tribe because it was dispersed. It did not have an inheritance as the rest of the tribes did with land, because they were to be dispersed throughout the entire nation to provide that spiritual instruction. So there's an amazing feature of these is it's the use of these same names over and over again from generation to generation. And the time that's covered by all these genealogies reaches all the way back to Jacob. And many of the names that we encounter in these genealogies remind us of some historical events that centered around those names throughout the Old Testament. And you can find them, if you just write these down if you want to. Exodus chapter 6, 1 Samuel chapter 1, 1 Samuel chapter 8, and Joshua 21. So that's Exodus 6, 1 Samuel 1, 1 Samuel 8, and Joshua 21.
And the reason we wrote those down was why?
There's talk about some of the occurrences that have to do these historical events. They're centered around some of the names that we read about. As a matter of fact, if you go in chapter 6 and verse 3, we see who are the two of the sons of Aaron. Who are the two notorious sons of Aaron that we read about? Nadab and Abihu. Absolutely. You know what's interesting? Those are two Old Testament names that you even talk to some small children, and even the small children could talk about Nadab and Abihu. and the consequences that come from disobedience to God. They thought they would. That's right. They put their sin on worship, right? And what was their sin? What was the verbiage given to their sin? What is it that they said they did? Okay, they offered strange fire before Jehovah, and what did God do to them because of their offering of the strange fire? Struck them down. No ifs, ands, or buts. There was no trial. There was nothing. It was a matter of he smote them where they stood, and they died where they stood. So we find that, of course, in Leviticus chapter 20 and verses 1 and 2, and Numbers 3, verse 4. And these two men left no children. So that part of that priestly line was ended with the death of those two men. Now, one of the interesting things that we find in chapter 6 is that all of the services of the tabernacle are presented as reaching as far back as the book of Exodus. And the one who is doing the chronicling tells us that their ceremonies were observed according to all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded them. First Chronicles chapter 6, verse 49. So nothing had changed, even though the people had changed and the people were going in and out of obedience to God. The service before God in the tabernacle did not change. He still held them accountable for all of these things. And we're going to see here, if we get there to that point tonight, we see where David finally brings all of that to a head. He brings back formal worship before God a little bit further on as we continue to read.
Sorry, Nate, I haven't abide you. What's the connection between what you're talking about? I'm just not sure.
Oh, it was just, we were talking about the Levitical line, and we're talking about, you look at some of the names that we see in here, and we realize that these are names, they're listed as simply being a part of genealogy in this portion, but we see a significant event that happens in regards to those two names that far back. We think about it, we see the account of it, but then here we read that there are two more names that are listed amongst the Levitical priesthood, amongst the Levites. The vast majority of these men serve in a dignified way and in the correct way before the Lord, yes. But the Lord has never been shy about telling us when his people have done wrong and the consequences for having done those things wrong. Look at Achan, the account of Achan. God didn't shy away from saying this man did something that was evil. These things were devoted to destruction. He kept them. He hid them, knowing full well that they were devoted for destruction. He kept them. He hid them underneath his tent. And when he was found out, he and his entire family were destroyed by God. It will, and especially when God said, "Look, this is what I want you to do. None of this is for you. Every bit of this is to be destroyed." So what did they do? They saw it, and again, the lust of the eyes,
yes,
the lust of the flesh. Ooh, that looks good. I want that. That's something that will be, I can enjoy this. And I will enlarge myself with it because now I'm a little wealthier than I was a couple of days ago. Now I've taken something. And listen, I don't feel guilty about it because this was a group, we took this from a group of idolatrous heathen, and I feel no guilt about it whatsoever. But God said, I don't want you to take any of it. All of it's devoted to destruction. But we're going to keep a little portion of that for ourselves. It shows God's attitude towards this situation as well. Yes, ma'am.
In the New Testament, he said, "So you got a lot of goods, got a lot of stuff stored up, going to build barns, make it bigger." And God said, "You're a fool. Just not your life will be required." That's
right. So what do we set our mind on? The things of men or the things of God? Things of God all the time. And even realizing that what we have belongs to God. Everything that we have truly belongs to the Lord. And he wants us to use it in the way that he wants. And one of the big problems is this person who was going to build bigger barns was thinking only of himself. Because he says, I will take my rest and I will eat and drink and be merry. And he says, you fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then who will those things belong to? He was concerned about the things of this world instead of the things of God. All right, so we go to, continuing in chapter 6 and verse 60, it says, all of their cities were 13. 11 of those are given here. Remember, there were 13 cities for the Levites. 11 of those are given here, and the other two are in Joshua chapter 21. It talks about the cities of the Levites. But they were not given part of what we call the land promise. the territory that was given to all of the other tribes. They didn't have that territory that was exclusively for them. They were scattered. They were spread out. Kind of like we tell preachers, right, Dave? It's like when they've achieved what they need to achieve in order to get their certificate, what do we don't say, well, hang around the place where you got your degree, sit around and wait for something to happen. We say, go, find a work, unfold your wings and fly, go out and do where you, and it may, the work of a preacher may take you to places that you never thought you would go. You may live in a state that you said, I would never live in this state. And then the call gets, we're looking for a preacher and we would like for you to come and preach to us. And then you find yourself in a part of the country or a part of the world or a part of the country or a state or a city or whatever it might be. You never thought you'd be there. And that's exactly what these Levites were for. So, all right. So what was the importance of these genealogies for the returning Israelites? Remember, these things were written down for their edification. They may not mean as much to us today because those names, we're not Jews. We don't trace our genealogy that far back, but it was important for them. Yes, ma'am.
Effectively by God, the genealogy, because he knew that genealogies were something that they took stock in.
Absolutely. It gave them a sense of belonging, didn't it? It gave them a sense of belonging. And well, let's look at this. It was important for them to realize, it was important for these returning Jews to realize that their captivity had simply been an interruption of their religious and national life. It was just a short blip. God says, I'm going to allow you to be taken away, but then I'm going to do what? I'm going to bring you back. And it'll be at my pleasure. You will not be able to do anything to affect your own release. I will be the one that will allow you to be taken away. I will cause it to happen. You will live there, and I liken it to think of maybe God is a lot like one of our parents. Then you'll learn to appreciate me. Maybe then you'll learn to appreciate me. Because remember where they were taken. They were taken to Babylon. And what was Babylon? Even in the New Testament, Babylon was used as a name to demark an absolutely wicked place. Rome was that generation's Babylon. So they would go and they would see the cult temples. They would see the imagery. They would see the altars. They would see all of these things. And you can imagine, as Paul, when he walked into Rome for the first time, can you imagine what he saw? Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
That's the reason the reason Revelation, John references Babylon and with respect to Rome in the book of Revelation, because the vast amount of trying to think of the right word now, not just idolatry, but depravity.
Depravity. Yes.
Depravity.
Yes.
And that was both existing in Babylon and in Rome, so we could easily interchange them.
Absolutely.
Refer to Babylon, but meaning.
See, we're very accustomed, and this does not speak well to the current generation. If you go back and you look at a history of Rome and you look at the things that were acceptable practices at that particular point in time, I think as Christians we would look at them and we would be aghast. We would see the things that were perfectly acceptable for the Romans to engage in. As a matter of fact, not only allowed to, but in many cases encouraged to, and even we in modern day would look at it and say that is unbelievable that this would be an acceptable thing, much less encouraged. Can you imagine how much it was for Paul, who was comfortably ensconced in Jerusalem and only went out to grab Christians and bring them back to be tried, in many cases put to death. And then now he is being taken from his comfortable surroundings in Jerusalem where the true worship of God lies, and he is being taken to a far land, into the very belly of the beast, which is Rome, and how his conscience must have been sore oppressed day after day to see the things that he saw. Okay. Well, this is the same thing that happens when the nation of Judah is carried away to Babylon. They realize too late how good they had it where they were. And it's commonly accepted that when they return, that the idolatrous practices were never that big of a problem for them ever again. They realized what the consequence was for putting another god before God. so that the return of the idolatrous practices never really surfaced again for the Jews. Now, when the Romans came in, they brought that with them, but by and large, they didn't have a problem with it anymore because they had seen the consequences. All right. So it was important for them to realize that this captivity that they were going to be engaged in was only a small blip. It was just for a short period of time. It's a long time in our minds. But when you're talking about a nation that had been around for that long, it's a small period of time, and it was just a small interruption. So these genealogies, as was said just a couple moments ago, gave them a significant link with their past as something that they could rely on, something that they could count on. It created a continuity between the pre-exile and the post-exile Israel. All right. All right. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Here we go. Again, there are discrepancies when these lists are compared with the other list in regards to Scripture, but it's really not a part of our purpose to attempt to early any explanation of it. For example, the word son is used no less than 9 different ways in Scripture, and there was a mixing of the tribes. If you go back, you could see where when the surviving spouse of one tribe married a husband from another tribe, there was an intermingling of the tribes in many cases. In some cases, the tribes began to die out altogether, and what small remained would be absorbed to one of the larger ones. So our purpose is not to do that. So these problems don't really concern us, and I don't hesitate to get too worked up about genealogies. But the purpose here was to form this strong link between the pre-exile and the post-exile Israel. And these genealogies accomplished exactly that. And they were certainly more understood far better by the descendants of those 12 tribes than anyone might have an understanding of them thousands of years later. The names would be very fresh and very familiar to them, but they certainly aren't to us. Especially when in AD 70, what happened with the temple? Destroyed, along with all of the what? All of the records. All of the records that were kept. Everything that they held important. When a child was born, you took him to the temple. You made sure that his name was taken down in the genealogy. You paid you offered up the appropriate sacrifice, and then your son is part and parcel of Israel. Well, when that went away, all of those genealogies meant nothing. It didn't do anything for them anymore.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Did you say there was a discrepancy between the pre-exile records and the post-exile records?
No, it provided a link between the two, these genealogies, because they could go back as far as Adam, and they could see that, and they could go when they came back, and Ezra had chronicled all of these things. They could go back and find their families. It also allowed the theocracy that was supposed to be in place in Israel. It was never meant to be a monarchy, except in the fact that God was the king. It was a theocracy. And what it allowed these people to do was when they came back, they were able to trace their lineage back to determine who was entitled to this, who was entitled to the throne. Remember what tribe was supposed to have the kingship? Judah, right? There was always going to be someone from the tribe of Judah sitting on the throne. Without those records, anybody could show up and say, but I can trace my family all the way back to here. Well, prove it. Well, take my word for it. And see, in the absence of any records, there are all kinds of mistakes to be made. But with these chronicles set in place, when the returning exiles come back, now we can establish a firm Levitical priesthood because we have the names of all of these people. Remember, it was a short period of time, all said. So now we can establish that theocracy, which is what it's supposed to be in the first place over again. All right. All right. And as we've stressed time and time again, these genealogies are absolute proof that the Old Testament deals not with myth or legend, but with history. It is a true history. All right, chapter 8. Continuing on. Chapter 8. All right. There's the full details that are given here in chapter 8, contrasted with a lot of the other tribes. It could be regarded as a special tribute. Remember whose genealogies we're looking at? First part of chapter 8 and verse 1. What tribe is this?
Benjamin.
Benjamin. What did Benjamin have to do with David? Remember, Benjamin was loyal to David and his dynasty. And it especially appears that special attention is given to the line of David's friend Jonathan, which is interesting because Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. But who was Saul's big enemy? Well, in his mind, David was not Saul's enemy. Saul's enemy was God. Saul's enemy, Saul had made an enemy of God, not of David. David had ample opportunity to take Saul's life on several different occasions and would not touch God's anointed. But Saul had it in mind that David was seeking to usurp the throne and marked David as an enemy of the state and hunted him high and low. But David never regarded himself as an enemy of Saul, which goes to show David's heart, certainly. Now, all of the names given far, all the way up to this point in Chronicles, belong to the people of pre-exile Israel. Now, in the first verse of the following chapter, in chapter 9 and verse 1, states that what has gone before only pertains to the official register of the families when they were exiled. So everything that we've mentioned, all the names that we've mentioned up until this point, were from the pre-exile Israel. And truthfully, it makes absolutely no difference at all exactly when the people of any of these lists actually live. What does Titus chapter 3 and verse 9 state?
Titus chapter 3, verse 9.
Titus 3 and verse 9.
And in order? No.
In a way.
Okay.
It says, but avoid certain things. Avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law. And it says very specifically why, because they are unprofitable and they are worthless. So it tells us that even now, or even when the book was written, even when Paul was writing to Titus, even then people were still clinging to the idea of I am of this and I am of this. And it goes even far, right? I am of Cephas and I am of Christ. I don't know what it is, but this idea of proximity to fame, proximity to importance, we take that almost as important as what's truly important. But it's not. It says, but avoid all of these things. They don't do anything. You can imagine even back then, remember the tribes didn't get along. It was only under David that the tribes actually came together to form a cohesive kingdom. Before this, there were quarrels and there were struggles and all of these things between these tribes. And you can imagine, because that's how the nations came to be, is because of strife and quarrels within the family of Jacob. So you can imagine that didn't change. It's like the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? 100 years after the Hatfields and McCoys, they still didn't get along. And now, over the years, they've managed to make things straight between them. But for a long time, it didn't matter if you were 5 generations removed, you had a problem. All right. But don't avoid these things because they are unprofitable and they are worthless. All right. So there's many things in this chapter and in the entire Old Testament that have to remain in what we would call they are hidden. They are mysteries. They're mysterious and they're unknown to us. In chapter 8 and verse 6, it talks about an exile. We don't know anything about that exile. Why did it happen? We don't know. Does it matter? No, not really. Not really.
First Chronicles 8 talks about the exile.
Chapter 8 and verse 6, there was another exile. It was just a small one. It was specific to a particular group of people, but it doesn't tell us who did that and why and what the purpose was behind it. If it was necessary for us to know, we would be told. But it's not. The hidden things belong to God. All right. Let's go to chapter 9. First Chronicles chapter 9. Verses 35 through 44 is a duplicate of First Chronicles chapter 8, verses 29 through 38. So 12 generations of King Saul are listed here. And I would think that the main reason for their being repeated would be that they were probably a pretty appropriate background for the record of the death of Saul, which is in the very next chapter. So he duplicates it from one chapter to the next. I'm sorry, First Chronicles chapter 9, 35 through 44. And it's simply a duplicate of 1 Chronicles 8, verses 29 through 38. So like I'm gonna make sure you get the point before we go into what happens with Saul, the death of Saul, which is of course in the very next chapter. But that's the end of the genealogies in the sense that the tribes are listed with the various heads of families that came from those tribes. But they are really the framework for the entire Old Testament. You notice they go all the way back to Adam, and everything is viewed from that lens of, you know, if you go back, were things happening in other parts of the world, certainly so. But what is the most important thing that we can read about is what's happening with God's people. What is God's plan, starting from the very first man Adam all the way through to the death of Christ on the cross? That's the single most important thing that we can be concerned about. That's it. No matter what happens in the rest of the world, no matter what great things occur, no matter what people ascend to thrones, no matter what mass destructions of people, doesn't matter. None of that really, at the end of the day, matters as much as what happened from Adam to the death of Christ on the cross, because that is the sum of humanity, is in that portion of. It's interesting that God saw fit to record every bit of that all the way through. I want you to know, because I'm going to establish all things. I'm going to show you my promises, and then I'm going to show you as they come to pass. I'm going to talk about the people, the places, and the events that occur behind the gospel of Jesus Christ, the coming of the Messiah. All right. As I said before, with all of this in place, it was possible for Ezra to restore the legitimate theocracy in Jerusalem after they returned from Babylon, because of those chronicles, the listing of the names and the genealogies. So these 9 chapters that are pretty much basically genealogical tables are maybe the most neglected chapters in the Bible. I don't know too many people that look forward. Can we talk about, you know, 1 Chronicles 1 through 9? Right. Nobody says, "Hey, let's have a class on that."
Right. But
they're there, and they're there for a purpose, and there's lessons to be learned from them, and that's kind of what we were attempting to do. But now we're going to kind of shift gears. We've gotten out of the genealogy. Let's go to chapter 10. Chapter 10.
the list of the genealogies was important in the fact that Ezra could now organize.
He could restore that theocracy, because now we have the names of the Levitical priesthood, and we have the genealogy of Judah. Now, other than those two, it was not near as important, except to restore the land to the people. But that was not always going to happen. I remember when they were taking it, one of the things that the kings would do, these conquering kings, they would come in, they would take out the best and the brightest, right? Daniel and his 3 friends, widely accepted that these were young men that were full of discernment. They had ability. These were carrying away. So there was this great brain drain out of Judah. But then what else would he do? He wouldn't just leave those areas barren. What would he do? What would the king do? He'd take his own people. He'd bring his own people. The Samaritans were allowed to come in and occupy a port. So the whole point was to carry them out and to displace them. So when they came back, hey, somebody's living in my house. Kind of like he's giving them really a taste of what the nations of Canaan experienced. I've been ejected from my land and ejected from my house, and now there's an Israelite living in my land, and he's tending my flocks, and he's gathering my harvest, and I work for that. But listen, I was found wanting in the sight of God, and I've been judged and found wanting, and I'm going to be punished for it. That's exactly what happened with them.
So as they went into Canaan to take that over, now God was going to give them a taste of it.
He's giving them a taste of their own medicine. And they come back, and that's why they never remember. God made it very clear that while they went into adultery, and then he brought them back, and he went into adultery, and he brought them back, and he went into adultery, and he brought them back, and finally he was going to bring them back to his, as the prophet states, I'm going to bring them back to my house, but they will no longer occupy that special place of a spouse in my heart. They're going to be basically a hired servant.
In a sense, God divorced them.
Essentially so. But remember, and even today, what do we read? What is the only acceptable reason for divorce? It's adultery. It's adultery. And that's what Israel did time and time and time and time again. And he kept bringing them back. And you think about it from a human standpoint, how often would your spouse have to commit adultery before you would finally put them away? But he did it time over and over again, over and over. That's why when we think about the idea of the mercy of God and the forgiveness of God is so far greater, because I'm telling you now, I love my wife, but if she committed adultery, it would be incredibly difficult for me to get past that. Maybe I could, with a lot of prayer and a lot of prayer and working things out. That may be something we could repair a marriage. But God said, my spouse has gone into adultery. It seemed like every time I turn around, she's gone whoring after gods. But I'm going to continually bring her back, and then she'll go again, and then I'll bring her back again, and then she'll go away again, and I'll bring her back again. But again, it goes to show the love and the fact that he says, you're going to be a possession. You're mine.
One of God's prophets was directed to take.
Hosea.
Yeah, Hosea was directed to take a prostitute. And I'm sure he's thinking, okay.
And what did that prophet? What did that spouse do? She went back into it, didn't she?
Yeah.
And then what did he do? He said, "Go get her back." She went and got her back. You can imagine. It's one of those things where I'm going to serve God. I'm going to do what He tells me to do. But at that point, I start thinking, "What is it? Are you serious?" Yeah, I'm serious. Okay, all right. And then when she goes, he's thinking, "Okay, I didn't want to be married to a prostitute anyway. So now go get her back." Oh man, this is my opportunity. I could turn the.
That's right.
But he did. He went and got her. He brought her back. He did it again. Okay. So chapter 10. This is our sort of a history of David's reign. We're going to get to David's reign goes almost up to chapter 27, where Solomon is brought in. But this is a history of David's reign, chapter 10 through 29. This chapter begins the record of the reign of David over all Israel. And it starts with this small brief account of Saul's death. And we find the parallel verses to this in 1 Samuel chapter 31. So this is a repeat of a portion of scripture in 1 Samuel. And it's like this up until the point of Solomon. It's going to be a parallel verse that we're going to find in Samuel. So the balance, what's left in 1 Chronicles is devoted to a review of the history of David. Falls into two parts. Chapter 10 through 20 is an account of his reign, of David's reign over Israel. And chapters 21 through 29 is a preparation for the building of the temple and the orders and arrangements of those priests which serve in the temple. All right. So two parts to that.
The parallels for Samuel 31.
31, yes, sir.
Gotcha.
So let's look at chapter 10. Let's read a little portion of this. Now the Philistines it starts in verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. Doesn't mean they took possession of him. It means that they overran his position. And the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul. And the archers found him, and he was wounded by the archers. Then Saul says to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and mistreat me." Now, did Saul have a reason to fear retribution from the Philistines? What was Saul's relationship with the Philistines? Much like David, much like God's relationship with the Philistines. It was not a good one. There was constant conflict going on between the nation of Israel and the Philistines. There would be it would not be a period of peace, but it would be a period of non-hostility, but then it would flare up again. And a lot of that had to do with when a new king would come, the new king would say, hey, you know what? Let's go raid the Israelites again. So they would come in, it would start the conflict again, and then there'd be this thing going back and forth, and then it would die off, and then it would come back up again, and it would die off. So Paul had reason to fear retribution for the Philistines. He probably knew a little bit about Judges chapter 16, verse 21. What happens in Judges 16 and verse 21? Whose account do we read about in that portion of scripture? Who fell into the hands of the Philistines? One of the judges.
Samson.
There we go. Samson. Of course. Samson fell into the hands of the Philistines. Now, did they treat him kindly and bring him and serve him a great banquet and put costly raiment on his back? What did they do to him? It says they did what? Gouged out his eyes. They blinded him, and then to add insult to injury, they made him grind grain on a wheel. Now, this goes to the idea of Dagon, who was one of the gods of the Philistines. There was a faulty belief a while back that Dagon was a fish god. He was not a fish god. He was a grain god. And we'll see here in just a couple of moments that they're going to try their best to do something to Saul, even though they weren't successful. So they forced Samson to serve in a mill. And you think about this, Saul, of course, knew the history of this. And the idea here is that he would rather die than be forced to do something as humiliating as Samson was forced to do. What would these men do? Likely they would not even kill him. Likely they would take him captive. They would mistreat him. They would humiliate him. And in doing so, they humiliated God and Israel. So it was this is excellent. We get to humiliate this man who's killed thousands and thousands of our strongest warriors. And then the God of Israel and Israel itself are humiliated by the things that we're doing. All right. So Saul fears this same humiliating fate, but his armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore, Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died. Thus Saul died, he and his 3 sons and all of his house died together. That's a sad state of affairs. The entire house fell. And we'll see here in just a couple of moments why this all occurred. When all of the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that the army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. I'll tell you what, let's stop there for our first break, and then we'll pick back up in just a couple of moments. We're starting back up again. Let's go back. We're continuing on in chapter 10, and in verse 8. I said, let's go back up to verse 7. When all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that the army had fled, the army of the Lord had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. This is common occurrence. There'd be this situation where the surrounding nations would come. They would raid the countryside of Israel. They would drive out the inhabitants, and then the king would have to make war, go back, take back the land, and allow the Israelites to live in it again. In this case, it's happening to the Israelites. The Philistines come and they've lived in these cities because the army of the Lord was defeated along with King Saul. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, common occurrence, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to their idols and to the people. So this is sort of a turnabout as fair play as far as Saul's concerned, right? Saul oversaw the defeat and the beheading of one of the Philistines, or one of the Philistine warriors, Goliath. His head was taken and his armor was taken. He was despoiled after being killed, and they're doing the same thing to Saul at this point in time. Verse 10, they put his armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. So if they couldn't get him alive and humiliated in Dagon's temple, they're going to take him dead. They took his head and they fastened it in the temple. But when all of Jabesh Gilead heard that all the Philistines had done to Saul, the valiant men arose and took away the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons and brought them to Jabesh. And they buried their bones under the oak in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Now this is a calm before a storm, because David is about to avenge Saul and avenge God's name. But at this point, Saul is now gone, along with all of his house. God said he was going to take Saul out. He was going to remove him from the throne. Remember, if Saul had simply done, let's continue on, because we're going to get to that point. In verse 13, this is important. Why did Saul lose? Why did Saul lose the battle? Why did Saul lose his throne? Why did Saul lose his life? It all comes down to chapter 10, verse 13 and 14. So Saul died for his what? Unfaithfulness, his breach of faith. Didn't start out that way, did it? So it started out, Saul and God had a great relationship. But what happened? Saul fell very quickly, and unfortunately, it was the Philistines that brought it to bear. Remember, he had defeated the Philistines, and he was waiting on the prophet to come and offer up the sacrifices. And in his mind, he justified in his mind that he would do it because, as he said, the people were departing, the people were leaving him, and the Philistines were beginning to encamp against him. And he, as he said, I forced myself and offered up the burnt offerings to the Lord your God. And what did the prophet say? He said, if you had simply done what you were told to do, he would have established your house forever. But now he has taken the throne away from you. Didn't mean he took him off the throne yet, but after Saul, his son would not sit on the throne in his place. That throne would go to another. Of course, we understand that to be David, son of Jesse. Yes, ma'am.
That's why the scripture says God sets up kings and takes them down.
Absolutely.
He installs leaders for his purpose.
Yes. And he established Saul. I mean, God loved Saul. God anointed Saul. He put the care and the treatment of the nation of Israel into Saul's hands. He established him as a shepherd of the people. And what did Saul do? At first, the relationship was a good one. But then, as unfortunately as is the one of mankind, his mind was pulled away, and he justifies his sin, which was a great sin. He justifies his sin before God. He says, Saul died for his unfaithfulness, his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium, seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore, the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So at the end of the day, who killed Saul? Wasn't Saul. Saul fell on his own sword, but who killed Saul? God did. God took him away. He destroyed him. So, if you look at caution, I mean, the Bible, the scriptures are filled with cautionary tales, but this is one that kind of jumps out because this is a man who was at the height. I mean, he was well known. He was well regarded. The people loved him. He was apparently a handsome fellow, good to look at, tall. Just the very epitome of a king of Israel. Somebody that, man, of course God would pick him because, man, just look at him. I mean, how can you? And it kind of compare and contrast that with the description of Jesus. What does it say about
nothing stately about it?
Nothing to recommend him. I mean, it's not that he necessarily was an ugly fellow, but he wasn't a handsome, tall, good-looking, ruddy young man. Exactly. He and I kind of liken that to the fact that, guess what? I'm not a tall, handsome, good-looking guy either. My wife likes the way I look, but thank for that. But at the end of the day, in the grand scheme of the world, I look like everybody else. But what does God look? God does not look on the appearance of men.
But also regarding this, it's like the old saying goes: those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
And Israel did that
time and time again. All right,
Chuck,
so yes,
you think about Saul and his reign. He started out as a faithful man to God, and then eventually turned from him. Go 2 kings later, you've got a king that the first thing he does is ask for wisdom so he can discern good and evil and rule the people. And before it's all said and done, he's got 700 wives, 300 concubines, collecting gold, silver, horses, and everything else.
Simply because possession of wisdom does not mean anything does it. At the end of the day, the simple possession of wisdom doesn't mean anything. Is the wisdom being put into practice? Solomon was wise, and this was not the wisdom that mankind deems important. This was wisdom from God. He says, I want to receive the wisdom that comes from you. Much like Elisha. Remember what Elisha asked for from Elijah? A double portion of what? Your spirit. I want the things of God. That's the important thing. So
There's knowledge and then there's wisdom.
sure.
Wisdom is the application of knowledge.
Absolutely. And part of that comes from experience and having been through certain things. And you hope that, but it's interesting, how many older folks do you know that have not achieved the kind of wisdom that you would expect from someone with, a head full of gray hair and stooped over? You think that the wisdom would just come pouring out, but simple age doesn't necessarily bestow wisdom.
I was blessed to know a beautiful senior saint in New Jersey, and we gave her birthday party at her favorite restaurant every year. And I had a chance for a quiet moment with her. I said, Grandma H, I hope if I live to be your age, I'm half as gracious and faith-filled as you are. And she laughed and her blue eyes sparkled. She said, oh, you do not magically become gracious and faith-filled at 65. She says, if you're a nasty, crabby 35-year-old, you'll be a nasty, crabby 65-year-old.
Unless you allow God to work in your life. That's exactly. Dave, were you going to say something that looked like you had your hand up? No. Okay. All right. So at the end of the day, again, this is this cautionary tale. Saul died for his breach of faith. If we are not careful to maintain our integrity in our faith, we will die for our breach of faith. It may not be a physical death, but it will be a spiritual death, because God can kill both body and soul. The worst way. That's the absolute worst way. So at the end of the day, this kind of unfortunately sums up Saul's, everything, all the good that he did is buried with him. And this is what we have from him. Saul died from his unfaithfulness, his unrighteousness. He broke faith with the Lord. There could be no worse thing said of us when they put us into the ground. I've been to so many funerals where the speakers talk about, they dance around every bit of the subject, that this person he was an unfaithful person. He was not a likable person. He was not a spiritual person. He wasn't a religious person. He wasn't a godly person. And they dance all around it by saying that all of the good things that he did. But at the end of the day, what's the best thing that could be said of us when they finally shovel that last shovelful of dirt on us, is that we remain faithful to God. And unfortunately, that's not what we found. Even if you look at it in an imagery type thing, what happened with Saul, even with Saul in his body, it was left to be despoiled by the Philistines after he died. He wasn't borne aloft on a shield, come back home and buried a hero's death. He remained on that hill until some valiant men said, this is not right, and they went and got him. But that's where he was. All right. So anyway, it was an ignominious end to a king that started with so much promise, but then quickly fell into an faithless state. Eventually, he didn't even consult God in his plans. He just simply did and hoped for the best. In fact, when he did consult, it wasn't even one of the prophets of God. He had consulted a medium, someone who was engaged in witchcraft, and which was unthinkable. So anyway, here we are. All right, so let's go to chapter 11. First Chronicles chapter 11. We see here in verses 1 through 3. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord your God said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Now, at the end of the day, who anointed David king over Israel? Who really anointed David king over Israel? God anointed David. Yes, Samuel, a prophet of God, on behalf, God said, you're going to go, this is the place you're going to go, and all of his sons are going to come in, and I'll tell you which one. And as they're coming out, surely it's this one, surely it's this one, surely it's this one. Finally, do you not have any more sons? Well, we have one. It's the youngest. He's tending the sheep.
Yeah.
Lowly shepherd. Who does that sound like? Bring him in. You know, it's kind of like the Cinderella. You know, like wait, got through all the stepsisters. Now we got to get to the real. So they bring him in. God said, "This is the one." So he was anointed by God through a man of God many years before, but now the elders of Israel have acknowledged him as king. David is dead, or Saul is dead. Jonathan, his family is dead with him. There's a power vacuum, and they anoint David king. They acknowledge him as true king. Now, here's the interesting, again, as is the custom at this time, it's never that simple, is there? It's never that simple. David is anointed king over Israel, but it's only after what? At first, he was king over Judah. Judah had acknowledged him, but Israel was still on the outs because they were still loyal to the house of Saul. But now that Saul is dead, and his son Ishbosheth is defeated and killed, now the elders of Israel acknowledge him as well. So he was already acknowledged. God had already anointed him king over the entire nation. The men of Judah had already acknowledged him as being their king. And now, with the house of Saul in complete ruin, the elders of Israel have acknowledged him. So what's happened here? What's essentially happened here? The nation is coming together. One of the things that David was able to do that Saul was not able to do is bring all of these disparate tribes under one common rule. They were an unruly people. They always had been. All right. So in chapter 11, verses 4 through 9, David's men capture, this is very important because this is going to have a tremendous effect a little bit later on. What happens in chapter 11, verses 4 through 9? What do David's men do? What area do they capture that will later, of course, become the city of David? Jerusalem. They capture the area that will become Jerusalem. Jebus. And I think I'm not very good at pronouncing these names, and I'm hoping that I pronounced that correctly. Is it Jebus? Jebus?
Jebus.
You don't know. Jebus.
I guess.
I'm going to say Jebus.
Yep.
Which is later become. Hello?
She's asking,
Jebusites?
what name are you saying?
Jebus. Yes, the Jebusites lived in that area. And David said, hey, whoever's going to go up against the Jebusites and will take that land, I'm going to make him chief. I'm going to make him commander. So here they go. They go and they capture, David's men capture the area. They drive out the Jebusites, and now that territory now belongs to David. It becomes what's known as the city of David, which is Jerusalem. And then later on, of course, that's where the worship of the Lord will be, formal worship of the Lord in a specific place, permanent place, is going to be instituted there in Jerusalem. So we find that in chapter 11, verses 4 through 9. But we also find a parallel in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 9. David's men capture Jebus, which becomes Jerusalem.
You're saying he reclaimed Jerusalem?
He takes it. In chapter 11, verse 4, and David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus. I will say that, where the Jebusites were the inhabitants of the land. So this is a region, it's an area. The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, you will not come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. David said, whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander. And Joab, who would later become the man in charge of David's armies, Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, so he became chief. And David lived in the stronghold. Therefore, it was called the city of David. And he built the city all around from the Millo in complete circuit. And Joab repaired the rest of the city. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. So he takes the region, and now it's his. Says, this is going to be my city. He needed a capital.
It wasn't prior to that.
No. You remember, he's conquering all of these. He's driving these people out from where they should have been driven out in the first place. So he's driving all of these people out, and now it's his, and it's called the city of David. It was his capital.
Do you know how many years that took from the spies and then David doing this? Do you know how many years it was?
Not off the top of my head, but it would be. I could probably calculate that fairly quickly. All right.
This is around 1000 BC, right? This happened.
Yes. The death of Saul was around 1000 BC.
And
So yeah, 1000 to 960 BC.
So back up.
Yes.
Just to make sure we're on the same page. So when Joshua and Caleb came in and they took over the promised land, Canaan, and then they had the judges over the promised land in various regions, and various judges, and that included the area of Judah, Medea, and Jerusalem. And then Saul became the first king for 40 years, right?
Right.
Where did he rule from? Was he in Jerusalem?
No, he was in
But he wasn't Jerusalem. But Jerusalem was not a Philistine camp at that time, was it?
No.
Late.
no, yes,
So
yes.
it wasn't in the hands of the nation of Israel. The Philistines had took it back, and then David comes and
Reclaims it. Yes.
I think that's what was being.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was. Yeah, remember when it was all said and done, the nation, the geographical region known as Canaan or what would become Israel was subdued. It was subdued, but that was one of the problems was that if you read the account of 1 Samuel, Saul was constantly fighting battles by the nations that were continually coming in and trying to reclaim that which they had lost. It was a constant battle. As far north as you can go, they would try to make inroads, and he would go. And this was one of the problems because the nation was not solidified. You had people who said, "Not our problem. Not our problem. We live up here. We live up here. That's for the tribes that dwell down there. We're not concerned about it." There was not a lot of concern, and that's why they, one of the bright spots of David's reign was that he was a king that the entire nation rallied around. They loved him. Once they figured out that God's hand was with him, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute, where there was a massive defection from the tribes that were loyal to the house of Saul. They defected over to David, and that's why it was a done deal when all of these elders of Israel recognized David's authority as God's anointed, realized that they were clinging to, it was like the South clinging to the Confederacy. It's like, this is not working. It's falling apart. David is growing and growing and growing. The house of Saul is diminishing. They said, the hand of God is with this man. And if we need to get on board. We need to, our allegiance needs to be to the one that has, God behind it. Yes, sir.
So, as you mentioned, it was still sort of very much a tribal nation.
Very much. Yes.
And so you had tribes like the tribe of Dan and some outskirts.
Very, yes.
First ones to fall because they're getting pressure.
That's right.
From their enemies.
Yep.
Same with Ephraim and Manasseh on the other side of the Jordan and such.
Right.
And so when David came, he solidified
right
the political nation of Israel, where Saul never did the same.
Never was able to accomplish it. There were people from the very beginning. When Saul broke faith with God, there were those who, when that happened, they began to distance themselves from Saul because God condemned him. It was known that God had taken the throne away from him, and these were the first people to lift up David when David began to And remember, David never sought to depose Saul. He was playing a waiting game. God had said, the throne is yours. You are God's anointed. You will be on the throne. David was simply saying, listen, I'm not going to touch Saul. I'm going to play the waiting game. God will get rid of Saul when God's ready to depose Saul. I'm going to wait. I'm going to play the waiting game. And he did. And as he's doing this, he's continually doing good. The people are, remember what they said? They said, we knew that you were the one that was going out and coming in with Israel. You're the guy. And so they waited and waited and waited. And when finally God took Saul out of the way, that was the dam finally burst. Massive defection. They turned their back on. Remember, Abner tried to put Saul's son Ishbosheth into on the throne. As a matter of fact, he essentially made him king, and then Ishbosheth broke faith with Abner, and finally Abner defected to David, and at that point it's a done deal. And then Ishbosheth dies, and David's firm grip on and it wasn't a grasp for power. That was not his purpose. The purpose was this was the nation of God, and they needed to be a cohesive nation of God. They needed to be underneath the throne. They needed to be underneath God's statutes and commandments. And at this point, it was very disparate. People just sort of did what they wanted to do, much like in the time of the judges. People were just doing whatever felt good to them. But he solidifies this throne, and it's important to realize that. And I tell you, we're going to get to it here in just a couple of seconds. As I said, yes.
You keep talking about, and you've mentioned it several times, and it's true, how David was not going to attack Saul.
No.
Think about when David finds out from the Amalekite that the Amalekite, even though he did not kill Saul, he said he did, and David had him put to death. He says, you don't touch God. You don't touch God's anointed.
You dare stretch out your hand against God's anointed? I mean, you can imagine. Now, this man thought he was going to ingratiate himself to David by saying, well, I struck down Saul. And he had no idea that he was going to lose his life for that rather foolish boast. I'm not sure what he thought was going to happen. Maybe David would reward him for having done that, but he did not have a firm grasp on his audience, did he? So David said, kill that man, kill him, execute him now. So no, David had no intention of taking the throne away from God, because the throne had already been given to him. It was God's to remove from Saul, and it was God's to give David in the first place. All right, so we read David's been captured Jerusalem. They eject these people, basically squatters. All right, they eject these Jebusites. They recapture Jerusalem, and it is established as a stronghold for David. Pretty good stronghold, right? What we read about Jerusalem, it's a city on a hill, surrounded by rock edifices, easily defended. Easy to see, great place to put a temple, you would think. As a matter of fact, I think they end up doing that. All right. Chapter 11, verses 10 through 47. These are the names of David's mighty men. Mighty men, of course, being warriors. Not really a whole lot of need to go through all of these names, and so we're not going to. But you find these replicated, or the parallel to this is in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 8 through 39. And if you notice at the very end of this, there's a name that, of course, jumps out at us, and that's Uriah the Hittite. He's included in these men, which makes it sort of a double treachery that David would do this. Took this man's wife and then killed him and several of his men by ordering them to be brought out into battle and then withdrawn from them. Just a horrible, and again, it's one of those things that we're just on the face of it, it's offensive. But then if you look at it a little further, you realize how much treachery was involved in David's sin in regards to Uriah. All right. 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 1 through 22. These are the defection of the men of Israel to the side of David. And in chapter 12, verses 23 through 40, this division that was between the house of Saul and David is now removed. And now David is recognized. The word oftentimes is anointed, but he is recognized as king over all of Israel, not just Judah, not just a portion of the nation, the entire nation. Every tribe acknowledges him as being king. All right, we find that, of course, again in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. That's the parallel there. All right, as we talked about in the genealogies of Levi, we're gonna look at this as brought to mind in First Chronicles chapter 13. The first attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem. The ark had not been in Jerusalem, right? Saul had lost it. It had been reclaimed. It was not brought to where it was going to have its permanent home. So David says it's time for the ark of the Lord to come back to Jerusalem. It's time for it to come back and be in a permanent place so that it can be established. All right.
Refresh my memory. Where was the Ark of the Covenant?
It had been in several locations. I think at least 3 locations, and it had also been captured by the Philistines.
And as a result, the Philistines had experienced such woes because they had it.
Yes.
Gave it back.
Yeah.
And what was the name of the city? Do you remember the name of the city that it was?
Ashdod.
Something like so.
It's Ashdod, I believe. Well, see, there were 7. I believe there were 7 Philistine lords. I think it was 7 Philistine lords, and each one of them had it as there were 3 cities that it went to in the 3 cities of the Philistine cities of those Philistine lords, and each one of them, it says that they developed tumors. The word is bubos, from which we get the word bubonic. So what happened was
Get the word boo-boo.
bubos,
Yeah, boo-boo.
Mhm.
Yeah, boo-boo.
bubonic plague.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, what did you say?
I said, I thought that's where we got the word boo-boo.
Well, I guess in the manner of speaking, that's exactly right. But as this house as this ark is being housed in everywhere it goes, it causes calamity for the Philistines. There's a plague. There are tumors that develop. So the Philistines said, okay, let's send it to another city. And as it gets to that city, they develop tumors. And then it gets ready to go to a third one. And they say, hold up. We heard what happened to the first 2 cities. We don't want it anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it would be a good idea to return it to Israel. I don't kind of like a landfill. It needs to be built somewhere, but not in my town. Well, this is their thing. Well, the ark needs to be kept somewhere, but not in my town. So they consult with the wise men. The wise men say, hey, send it back to Israel, but don't let it go back unaccompanied. You have to send God tribute. So they send the golden mice and the golden tumors as a tribute to God. They put it on a cart with I think it was a heifer. And they say, watch it. If it goes the way it's supposed to go, leave it alone. And it goes exactly where it's supposed to go. And lo and behold, through no action of Israel, the ark comes back to Israel, which is, I think, even more significant. They didn't go and heroically rescue it from the Philistines. They didn't have that ability. God got his ark back to them. God brought it back to them. They couldn't do anything. Remember, it was the capture of the ark that led to who dying on the side of the road? What prophet?
Yeah, came over and he grabbed it.
Eli, right? He's sitting there in his he's an old guy, kind of heavy. He's sitting there, and the word comes that the ark of the Lord is lost. And it actually says that the lamp of God was out, had gone out in Israel. The ark has been captured. Yep. His 2 sons were dead. The ark is captured. He falls backwards and breaks his neck. Calamity, right? So the Philistines have the ark, and they finally say, this is not working. They took it to one of their temples, one of their gods. God falls over. They come in the next morning, he doesn't fall over, they put him back up. Next morning they come in. Not only is he falling off, he's broken in 2 and his hands is cut off. Hands are cut off. God's proving a point to them. Okay. All right. So anyway, David says it's time to bring the ark home. All right. So they tried to bring it. They make one attempt. The problem was this: David falls into the same trap that Saul did in chapter 10, verse 14. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you read the second account, if you read the parallel account, David knew what was necessary to do. He simply didn't do it. All right. How did they try to bring it back the first time? That didn't work.
On a cart with drawn by oxen with, was it Uzzah?
Uzzah.
Uzzah, who was
Yep.
leading it, and.
Yep.
So it was not according to the prescribed way of travel.
Absolutely, absolutely unacceptable. Exodus chapter 25, verses 12 through 25. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and you shall put them on its 4 feet, 2 rings on the one side of it, 2 rings on the other side of it. You shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the side of the ark to carry the ark by them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. So what happened? David simply did not do what was prescribed by God. Who was to bear the ark? You just call a couple of guys out of the, it's like a pallbearers. Hey, can you help? And you help? Who was supposed to carry the ark? Only who? The priests. Only the priests were to carry the ark.
Yet Eli was struck down, or his hands were removed. He was a priest, right?
His hands were removed. I'm not sure.
Uh,
You're thinking the temple of Dagon, where the Philistines kept the ark of the Lord. His statue of Dagon fell over, and his hands came off of the statue.
okay.
That's probably what you probably. Yes. All right.
He was a priest, right?
Eli was a prophet. He was the man of God. He was the one that if inquiry was to be made of the Lord, you went to Eli, and then you went to Samuel. What are we to do? Talk to the Lord. See, we have this impression somehow that David,
Eli was a priest.
he was a priest.
But he had 2 sons that were wicked.
Nadab and Abihu.
So this is Eli that preceded Samuel when he was a kid. Is that right? I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm trying to get my facts straight. This is a refresher, and it's Eli, wasn't he the priest predecessor to Samuel?
Yes.
Okay.
Samuel, I don't know if you call it a successor in that Eli trained him early. Yes.
Okay, so I'm getting some names mixed up.
Okay.
So who did you say? The priests were the ones to carry the Ark of the Covenant.
Priests were the ones to carry the Ark of the Covenant.
And Eli was long before this, right?
He
trained up Samuel.
I wouldn't say necessarily long, because he was alive. It was when the ark was captured that he lost his life, that he died, falling backward. I don't know if you call it a long period of time, but it was several years before this.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, we'll carry on. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
All right. So what do? They get what they call a new cart, and the 2 oxen were to be carrying it. The question is, though, did God ever prescribe a cart? Can we read anywhere where there's supposed to be a cart that's carrying the Ark of the Covenant? No. If God wanted a cart, what would he have asked for? A cart. All right.
Specific ways to move it,
Very specific.
very specific, very detailed, and they did not.
Yeah. They even got it right in Indiana Jones. They couldn't get it right this close to the institution. So here's the question then. This is a good question to be asked at this particular point in time. Do we make the same mistake oftentimes in our worship and service? Do we look to the word, or do we decide for ourselves what would be the best course of action?
The word.
So we obviously should look at the word. What does the word say? The word gave specific instruction as to how the ark was to be brought, to be carried at all. And in fact, one of the reasons that it was removed from Israel in the first place was because the Israelites believed that they could use it as some sort of secret weapon against their enemies. Hey, things aren't going very, very well. Go get the ark, as if God it's to be used as some sort of a magic weapon. And so what happens? They bring the ark to this heat of the battle. The Philistines decide, hey, we're going to push it a little bit harder. Here it comes. Hey, gird yourselves up. This is it. And they ended up beating the Israelites, and they took the ark as booty, fodder, loot, whatever it might be.
Spoils of war.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good way to look at it. Spoils of war. All right. Let's see, chapter 14, verses 10 through 13. We're going to get to the second attempt here in a couple of minutes. But chapter 14, verses 10 and 13, what does David do in between this period of time? He strikes down the Philistines. Now, here's an interesting way of looking at this. What did David do differently? What did he do 2 times in chapter 14, what did he do of God to find out what he should do? He inquired, right? He asked specifically, shall I go? Shall I do this? He inquired of God. If you don't want me to, I'm not going to. Shall I go? And what does the Lord say? Yes, go. I'm with you. I'm with you. You will prevail. So David makes the effort to inquire of the Lord what he should do. Good idea for us even today, right? Ask the Lord, shall I do this? Now, not to think that we're going to be laying in bed and God's going to whisper in our ear, but he has ways of letting us know that he is with us or he is opposed to us. Was a fellow that I used to know, and one of the ways he would pray when he would lead public prayer, he would ask the Lord to bless us in the things that you desire for us, but defeat us in the things that you don't want for us. So sometimes he works in both of those ways.
Yeah.
Defeat us in the things that we want to do that you don't want us to do. Because sometimes we misread. I'm talking about misreading. We can certainly do that. All right. So he defeats the Philistines twice and really puts them to rout. So the question then is, was this kind of a sweet moment for David in avenging the death of Saul? Remember, David loved Saul, and he mourned the fact that Saul had counted him as an enemy, and he mourned this death of God's anointed. So you can imagine this was sort of like a pretty sweet victory when he goes and defeats, on two different accounts, defeats the Philistines and the things that they were trying to do. All right, so he strikes them down.
That's all in the 14th chapter.
That's all in chapter 14.
He defeats them twice.
He defeats them twice.
Okay.
Yes. All right, in chapter 15, David learns his lesson. And he says, David said in chapter 15 and verse 2, second. Then David said that no one but the Levites may carry the ark of the Lord, for the Lord had chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever. So David wasn't pleading ignorance of the law, but he was guilty of a violation of the law. All right. So this record that we have here kind of removes any doubt of the authenticity of the book of Moses. So the regulations, this idea that this precept that God had, that only the priest may carry it through with the wooden staves that were located inside of those rings, had existed throughout the entire history of Israel from the time of the Exodus, and they were observed even during the time of the wilderness. Remember, they encamped at a place and then they would pack up and they would move again. Who carried the ark? The priests carried the ark. How did they carry it? With the wooden staves that were driven through those rings. All right. So this was a regulation that had existed from the time that God said, "Hey, build me an ark."
So,
and now David acknowledges that, and now they're going to do the way that they're supposed to be doing it.
So how was it being done? The way it was supposed to be done is different than how it was actually being
yes.
done. And he called them out.
He called them a God. Well, what happened? There was if they had not had that car, if they had been carrying the ark the way that they were supposed to be carrying the ark, would Uzzah have perished?
He wouldn't have had to reach out and write. He was trying to reach out and write. His intentions were good, but that's not what God said.
That's exactly right. And sometimes our intent what's paved with good intentions. Yeah. Uzzah did not want the ark. I mean, he was zealous for the ark of the Lord. He saw it precarious, and he saw it shaking. He was worried it was going to fall out of that cart, or some calamity was going to occur. He reaches it out his hand, he touches it, and God strikes him dead. And it says that David was angry, but I question whether David was angry with God or David was angry with David. In his haste, in his desire to bring that ark back, he didn't do it the way that it was supposed to be done.
So, God is righteous, so he had no right to be angry at God.
Yeah.
But now a lot of people are angry at God.
Yep. Well, he admits this in chapter 15, verse 13, because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us. And he acknowledges this because we did not seek him according to the rules. So he makes it very clear. He doesn't hold God. Listen, God did what God does. We did not consult him. We did not seek after him.
And yet
we did not inquire.
And he was so interested in doing it right, and yet he kicks himself for doing it wrong. That's what I don't get.
Well, I think this is because of David's heart. David had a heart that was inclined towards God. He wanted to do the right thing, even though he didn't always do the right thing. And when David messes up, he is quick to acknowledge it, and then he goes as far as he possibly can towards making it right. There's nothing he could do for Uzzah, is there? Not a thing that he can do for Uzzah. He can kick himself, and in hindsight, how long did that man's death weigh on his mind? Listen, that man died because I did it the way that I thought we should, and he lost his life. Now, Uzzah was the one that stretched out his hand. No one forced Uzzah to do that, but that would never have been an issue had it simply been done right in the first time. God was not going to allow something to happen to his ark if the men doing it were doing it correctly. It's just not going to happen. Exactly right.
So just to clarify.
Yes, sir.
So in terms of whether David was angry with God, and I'm not trying to just read what it says. In 1 Samuel 6, verse 8, David became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So
right.
David was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" And so David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord in the city of David. But David took it aside in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months, etc., etc. So I do think that David was upset with the Lord. He may have at some point began to reflect upon that, but I do think he was upset at the Lord because he took us. And think about it this way. So the king is the one that directed the way, the travel and the method of travel. Uzzah, and I think there's other issues with Uzzah. He had an attitude issue. That's a different issue.
Right.
But Uzzah was killed for David's direction.
Yeah.
Right.
So he was upset with the Lord.
You think that's fair enough point. I can't disagree with that at all. I believe that David, if he was a man after God's heart, and he was, I believe that David felt a great deal of remorse and guilt, and bore that at the end of the day. Right. And it's like anything else. I'll liken it to this, and it's been several years ago. I got pulled over. I was going a little over the speed limit, had a lead foot. I thought I needed to be somewhere much quicker than I would. When I got pulled over, you know who I was angry at? I was angry at the cop. Do you not understand? I've got someplace that I need to be. I was angry at the person in authority, but then as I got that ticket, a couple miles down the road, guess where my anger started to get directed? I messed up. I blew it. And now I've got a point against my record possibly. And depending on my insurance company and their sense of largesse towards me, I might end up paying a higher premium. At the end of the day, I got less and less angry at the policeman and more angry at self, which is the way it should be. The policeman was doing what? He was exercising his authority. Yeah. He did what he was supposed to be doing. Now, I wish he could have done it to the guy way in front of me or the guy way behind me, but I happened to be the guy that came down the pike at the time that he had his radar gun out, and he clocked me at 11 miles per hour over the speed limit. Again, I can lift up my hands and say, why me? But at the end of the day, hey, mea culpa. It's my fault. So I can't argue with that point. Was David angry at the Lord? Probably so. But at the end of the day, he feared him. And that's the beginning of knowledge, right? It's the fear of the Lord.
Hey, Chuck.
Yes, sir.
There's another question we need to ask. When David decides to put this thing on a cart, where were the Levites? Because it says all of Israel is there. Why did they not say, wait a minute, King? The Bible doesn't tell us, but that's always been you look at the history of the Israelites, a lot of times they were in trouble because they did not, the Levites didn't do their job in teaching the people the correct way to do things. And it's just interesting that the Bible says that all of Israel is there, but David says, put this thing on a cart. The Levites in their responsibility should have said, wait a minute, King, that's not the right way to do this thing.
And I think you have a valid point in the idea that even though David is king, remember the priesthood was removed from the kingship. Those were two separate institutions. There was the king of Israel, with all of the separate administration that went to David. But then you have the priesthood that exercised their own authority. There was a breakdown here, wasn't there? In many ways, there was a breakdown of and I hate to use the word breakdown of communication but that is essentially what it was. Rather than insist and inquire and make preparation, it was get it back, and this is the way that we're going to do it. Now, it was done at the direction of David, but the priests had the ability to simply say, behold, before we engage in this endeavor, remember this, because it was known. David even says in chapter 15 and verse 2, he says, then David said that no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God. How was that known? Because it was known. That was what was prescribed. It was prescribed from the beginning. This was a I can't even use the word comedy of errors, but that's essentially what it was. So many mistakes made, all with good intentions, but at the end of the day, the mistakes were made, and the mistakes ended up costing one man his life. And then what does it say? Look at it says in just a moment. Like we said in chapter 13 and verse 12, David was afraid of God that day, and he said, how can I bring the ark of God home to me? So what did he need to do? Inquire. How can I bring the ark of the Lord home to me? Well, this is what you do. Anyway, it was again. So let's continue on, because we need to get this. Ooh, man, we're running out of time. All right. In chapter 15 and verse 14, so the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. So there were some steps to be involved in this, right? They consecrated themselves. They prepared themselves. And the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles as Moses had commanded, according to the word of the Lord, which is the way it should have been done in the first place. All right. Let's see. Yeah. David summons in verse 11 through 15. David summons the priests Zadok and Abiathar, and the Levites Uriel, Asaiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Eliel, and Aminadab, and said to them, you are the heads of the fathers of the house of the Levites. Consecrate yourselves, you and your brethren, so that you may bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place that I have prepared for it. Because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us, because we did not seek him according to the rule. So they did just that. The priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the pole, as Moses had commanded, according to the word of the Lord. Now, it's interesting because this account, usually the second account is more detailed. And this one in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 12 through 15. In this case, the account in Chronicles is actually a little bit more detailed than the one that we find in 2 Samuel chapter 6. All right, so God, finally, David seeks out the word, the command of the Lord, the rule of the Lord. They bring it back to Jerusalem, and as they're bringing it back, you look at what's happening. Let's see. The better account, in my opinion, the more detailed account is actually in Samuel, but they bring it back, and as they bring it back, every 6 steps taken by the priests, they offer up a sacrifice. So you think about that. As far as they had to go, how many animals were sacrificed? Now, remember, this is not commanded by God to do this. This is David wanting to show, maybe he's wanting to, you can't make amends. That's not what he's doing, but he wants to show how important this is and how important the people are to see it, and the importance of the ark. So every 6 steps, they sacrifice an animal, and in another 6 steps, they sacrifice another animal. And they continue on all the way that we find in 2 Samuel chapter 6. All right. Now look at verse 29 of the same chapter, verse 15, chapter 15, verse 29. Now, if you want to get this account, the full account of this problem that we see, go to 2 Samuel chapter 6. All right. As the ark of the covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David dancing and celebrating, and she despised him in her heart. So all is not well in David's household. His own wife despises him. This is a wife that he's had for quite some time. So what's happening here? Well, there's multiple things, right? We got the death of her father. The fact that David was able to bring the ark to Jerusalem, restore it to the people. David is receiving acclaim from all of the people, while her father's house has diminished to the point of extinction. David's house is enlarging and receiving acclaim. But I think really the problem that we find is in chapter 14 and verse 3. What's David done? As his house has gotten larger, literally his house has gotten larger. What has David multiplied to himself? Wives. And with those wives, he's having more children. So now, as we say, the wife of your youth is being neglected. It's a matter of course. Remember, David's taking all these wives, but this is not in accordance with God's will. Simply because David did it, it's much the same way as Solomon. Simply because Solomon did it, even with all of his wisdom, doesn't mean that it was something that God was pleased with or was accepted to itself. All right. Now we look at that and we think, why would anybody need that many wives and concubines? The vast majority of these were political. It was political marriages. It was, now I've got a son-in-law that's, he's the king of Israel, and it was establishing alliances. And I mean, that was commonplace back then, but it wasn't something that was supposed to be found in God's people. That just wasn't, it was not born of God. That was not God's idea.
Because it puts your reliance, putting your reliance now on God.
Yep, absolutely. And it's interesting because what did God tell the nation of Israel as they prepare to take the land of Canaan? What was one of the things that he told them not to do? Not to intermarry and not to make alliances or treaties with these other countries. So what did they proceed to do? Intermarry with the pagan nations and make treaties with them through those marriages in many cases. Now, some of them were, Solomon saw a good-looking woman and said, I think I would like her to be my wife. Now, again, what was the warning that God gave the nation of Israel? He was going to take your best young men and he was going to take your best young women. They were going to serve him. In some cases, the women were going to be his wives. In other cases, they were going to be his bakers and his cooks. The young men were going to run before his chariots into battle. And he says, I'm warning you all of this. And they said, no, but give us a king. So God gives them the king. He said, they haven't rejected you. They rejected me. Just do what they tell you to. Just do it. Do it. Don't take that personally. They've rejected me. So again, simply because David had a heart after God, his heart was inclined towards God. He was a man after God's heart. Doesn't mean that everything that he did was wise or accepted. All right. All right. We got a couple more minutes. I'll tell you what we'll do is we blew right past our last break, so we'll take off a little early. All right, so chapter 16. All right, in this chapter, David brings the ark to Jerusalem. He brings it to the prepared place. And if you look at that, if you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 13, you see the importance of the ark to David as his heart is inclined towards God. All right. This idea of offering those extra sacrifices, that was not commanded by God, but David wanted to please God. He was going to go overboard in his worship and adulation towards God. Not a bad idea. It was. I mean, this was a monumentous occasion. When it was taken, it says that the lamp of God had gone out in Israel. Now the glory of God is being restored to Israel. And that was part of God's great plan. He was going to put the right man in the right place at the right time to bring back this ark and restore this glory to Israel. It was the definition. The mercy seat of God was right there. That's why the construction of the temple was such a huge occasion, and the sheer number of, you think the sacrifices that David did was extra. Where we read about the construction of the temple, the sheer magnitude of the animals slaughtered on those altars, or that altar was it was monumentous. Why? Because this is God dwells amongst his people. Now this beautiful building, permanent construction with overlaid by gold. And you can imagine, now to us, we might think, it's a little bit gaudy. This is the dwelling place of God. Every bit of it deserves to be overlaid with gold 3 times over. So it was the glory of God had returned to Jerusalem. It was the very dwelling place of God, the mercy seat of God. And you read about the ministry of the priests and the high priest as he would go into that holy of holies to where that ark was, and God would sit on that mercy seat, and he would make intercession. It's a beautiful thought, and this is the beginning salvo of that worship, that permanent worship that the Israelites were going to have to their God in Jerusalem.
You mentioned you thought he went overboard a little bit.
That's just my terminology. I don't think he went overboard at all. God deserved everything that David did and more, but there's only so much you can do. I mean, as he sacrificed every 2 steps? At some point you're gilding the lily, but God deserved every bit of what David was doing. Think about what God had done for David. He had taken him from the least in his father's household and established him as king over his own people. And he actually refers to him as a shepherd over the nation of Israel. Not just king, but a shepherd. I mean, you're not only going to exercise kingship, but you're going to guide the nation. They're going to incline towards you. They're going to listen. They're going to watch. That's what makes his sin with Bathsheba so repellent, is the fact that it was known, and it was given an opportunity for the enemies of God to gloat and to mock and to ridicule Israel and Jehovah.
I believe Uriah.
What's that?
I believe Uriah.
Yeah.
That. Right. No, Uriah. Yeah. He knew that one of the reasons he didn't go to the David. Well, we'll get there, I guess.
Yeah.
Just because he knew.
Yeah. I mean, it was things like that. They don't happen in a corner. Yeah, it was known. I mean, they even said it was known. Yeah, they don't. All right. So verses 1 through 3, it is clear that the sacrifices were being presented by the whole community of Israel, but it's with the Levitical priests performing their proper functions. They are again instituting regular and I use the word mechanical worship in the sense that that was the purpose of the priests, were to do certain things to enable worship by the people. All right. So the priests are performing their proper function. Now, David is here, but he's not acting as a priest, right? David would not act as a priest. Unlike Saul, who sought to usurp the position of a priest, all the while, justifying that, David doesn't appear, he's not appearing here as a priest. He's appearing as a king who supervises the proper activities of worship. Remember, he's supposed to be a shepherd, but he enables them to do the things that they're supposed to do. He commands them, do your job. I will support you in this. The nation will support you in this. All right, so in verses 4 through 6, Levitical leadership of worship is confirmed. Levitical leadership of worship is confirmed. He appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord to invoke, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. That would preach. Asaph was the chief, and second to him were Zechariah, Jeiel, Shemiramoth. I'm not going to read all of those. All of these men who were appointed to do all of these things, they were to play harps and lyres. Asaph was to sound the cymbals, and Benaiah and Jehaziel, the priests, were to blow trumpets regularly before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Then on that day, David first appointed that thanksgiving be sung to the Lord by Asaph and his brothers. So if you look through chapter 7, verse 7 through 36, you could probably entitle it, "Let's open with a prayer." And you look at this prayer that David offers up, and you find portions of this in three particular places: Psalms 105, Psalm 105, Psalm 96, and Psalm 106. You find portions of that in each of those portions of Scripture where David offers up this prayer. And the prayer stands as perfectly worded and written today as it was when it was first penned by David. You read this prayer, and if you doubted David's intention in his heart, it is put to rest, because this is a man who acknowledges God as sovereign God of the universe, the Lord of Israel, the fount of all blessings, everything. Like verse 14, he is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. Remember his covenant forever. The word that he has commanded for 1,000 generations. That's interesting. 1,000 generations. So what's his covenant? Well, first the covenant was what? With the nation of Israel. But what was that supposed to segue into and give way to? His covenant with all the nations of the earth. So the first covenant of necessity was done away with because it had come to its completion. But then there was another covenant that he made with his people. And who are his people now? Is it the nation of Israel? No. It's Christians. So his covenant, it's a spiritual Israel. It's a spiritual Israel. The word that he commanded for 1,000 generations.
Yet there are those, and I'm sure you know this, that still say that the nation of Israel is still God's chosen.
Oh, absolutely. I've gotten more than a few discussions with people who have, and that's, of course, that's a discussion. That's a major discussion, but it is still something that a lot of people are very confused about. But his covenant is with the spiritual Israel, not the physical Israel. Still Israel, but it's not the Israel that we find over in the Middle East. It's the Israel that's scattered all over the nation. Every corner of the globe has the spiritual Israel. Absolutely. So anyway, if you go through this, I encourage everybody to read this entire prayer that he offers up, because if you think about it, I can't think of a better way to, I hate to say kick off, but I would say inaugurate permanent worship in Jerusalem. This is just a beautiful prayer. And after you hear this, I can't imagine a single Israelite is not just excited that now it's finally coming together. Remember, for many years there was a lot of confusion, there was disruption, there was chaos, there was no cohesive national identity, and now they have one. It's located in Jerusalem, and they've rallied behind it. They're all in favor of it. They're all excited about it. What do we need to do? This is what we're going to do. They're going to do the Levites are going to do everything necessary for the nation to worship acceptably to God. Here we go. And they back the play. It's incredible. All right. So in verse 37, permanent worship is established in Jerusalem. Asaph and his brethren were left there to, as it says, minister before the ark continually. So now notice at this time, though, that the ark and the tabernacle were in separate locations. And this is going to be rectified. Was it incontinuity, discontinuity, whatever it is going to be rectified under the leadership of Solomon when he builds the great temple in 2 Chronicles 5 and 1 Kings 8. And it didn't appear that this troubled the Lord, because he made no command to bring the two together, and it wasn't going to be necessary until the temple was created, but not under David, of course, under Solomon. I tell you what, let's finish there. My voice is about to give out. I think we've gone as far as we can. We'll pick back up. If you want to read from chapter 17 on, and then after we get done with that, we'll pick up with 1 Kings 1 and 1 Chronicles chapter 28. That's when the accounts begin to mirror one another in a way, and we'll get into that at that time.
Say it one more time.
1 Chronicles 17 through 27. Just read through those, make your notes in the margins, or put together any questions that you might have. We'll do everything that we can.
1 Chronicles 17
through 27. Right. All right, folks. Good to have everybody that was with us tonight. You're always welcome to come in person. If not, we're glad that you're watching online. But have a great rest of your night, and we will see you next week.
the real faith builder